Something hit Amazon servers in Bahrain 3 times in 32 days. Not hackers. A day, not a technical failure. Ballistic missiles fired by a state actor who published a list named the targets, warned the employees to evacuate, and then executed exactly what they said they would execute on schedule, with precision that should alarm every person watching this, regardless of where you live or what you think about Middle Eastern politics. I want you to stay with me for the next few minutes because what I'm about to walk you through is not the version of this story you've been getting from the financial press or the cable news networks. The surface story, the one about oil prices spiking and tankers sitting anchored outside the Strait of Hormuz, that story is real, but it is the smallest part of what is actually happening. The deeper story, the one about what this conflict has permanently changed about the nature of war itself, about who is a target and what a battlefield actually is in the year we are living in, that story has barely been told. And by the end of this video, I think you will understand why that silence is not an accident. Let me start with something concrete because I think concrete details are what separate real analysis from commentary theater. On the 31st of March, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps published through official state channels, not anonymous social media, not rumor, official documented attributed channels, a formal statement declaring 18 major American companies to be legitimate military targets. The list included Apple, Google, Microsoft, Meta, Nvidia, Boeing, Cisco, Intel, General Electric, JP Morgan Chase, Palantir, Tesla, and G42, Abu Dhabi's flagship artificial intelligence firm. The IRGC warned employees at all 18 companies to vacate their workplaces. They warned civilians within 1 kilometer of any associated facility to evacuate. And then, within hours of their stated deadline, Iranian missiles struck the facility in Bahrain housing Amazon Web Services infrastructure. I have spent years studying how states use force and how they signal strategic intent. I have watched governments issue ultimatums and walk them back. I have seen red lines evaporate the moment someone called the bluff. This was not that. Iran told you exactly what they were going to do. They told you exactly when they were going to do it. So, a day and such and dates, and then they did it. That is not escalatory rhetoric. That is operational discipline. And that distinction matters enormously for understanding where this is heading. But before we get to where this is heading, I need to take you back to the beginning of this campaign against digital infrastructure, because the Bahrain strike was not the opening move. It was the third act. On the 1st of March, day 2 of what Iran designated Operation Epic Fury, Shahed drones struck 2 AWS data centers in the United Arab Emirates and damaged a third in Bahrain. 109 AWS services went offline across the region simultaneously. Banks lost access to their core processing systems. Payment platforms crashed across multiple countries. The UAE stock market did not open for 2 full days. And Amazon Web Services, one of the most sophisticated and heavily redundant cloud operations on Earth, waived all customer charges for the entire month of March because the disruption was so severe and so widespread that there was functionally nothing left to bill for. Think about what that means operationally. A cloud provider so thoroughly disrupted that they cannot in good conscience charge their customers for services that simply did not exist. Then it happened again in late March. A second major disruption to the Bahrain availability zone attributed to drone activity. 3 strikes, 32 days, each one more deliberate than the last, each one more openly claimed. Now here is the question that the mainstream analysis keeps stepping around. Why data centers? Why servers? What's a done? Why would a state actor with genuine ballistic missile capability choose to spend those missiles on cloud infrastructure when there are oil fields and military installations and shipping lanes all sitting in range? The answer to that question is the most important thing I can tell you in this video, and it requires understanding something about how the United States military has quietly restructured its most sensitive combat operations over the last decade in ways that the American public was never really asked to approve. The Pentagon runs classified and sensitive military workloads on Amazon Web Services. This is not a secret. It is a matter of public record. The Joint Warfighting Cloud Capability Contract, the system that integrates American combat operations across every branch of the armed services, is built on commercial cloud infrastructure. The same commercial cloud that hosts your streaming subscriptions and your corporate email. And here is where it gets specific in ways that the financial press has almost entirely failed to report. Anthropic's artificial intelligence model was deployed inside AWS's classified cloud environment through a documented partnership with Palantir. Pentagon Chief Information Officer Kirsten Davies confirmed this directly and under oath to the Senate Armed Services Committee. U.S. Central Command used that AI system to process intercepts, analyze satellite imagery, and work through signals intelligence, generating real-time threat assessments and operational targeting data in support of active combat operations. In July of 2025, the Department of Defense awarded AI firms a contract worth up to $200 million for precisely these services. A commercial artificial intelligence product marketed to the public as a writing assistant and research tool was integrated into the United States military's live targeting architecture during active combat operations that resulted in strikes on over 1,700 targets in the first 72 hours of a war. And the connection between that AI system, the company that built it, and the cloud infrastructure that housed it has now been used by a hostile state actor to justify treating commercial data centers as military targets. This is not a slippery slope argument. This is the documented operational reality, and it has produced kinetic consequences on the ground in Bahrain. Iran connected the dots that Washington hoped nobody would connect, and then they acted on those dots with ballistic missiles. When Iran's Fars news agency stated that the Bahrain AWS facility was deliberately targeted to expose the role of these centers in supporting the enemy's military and intelligence activities, they were not constructing a legal fiction after the fact. They were pointing at a factual relationship that the United States government had already confirmed under congressional testimony. There is something else about this story that has been almost completely buried, and it speaks to the institutional dysfunction at the center of Washington's position in this conflict. In late February, just weeks before the war began, Anthropic pushed for contractual guardrails that would prevent the military from using their AI system for mass surveillance of American citizens or for fully autonomous weapon systems without human oversight. The Pentagon's response was to demand unrestricted access for all lawful purposes. The negotiations failed. Trump ordered federal agencies to stop using the system entirely. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth designated Anthropic a supply chain risk, a designation normally reserved for foreign adversaries. And then the war started, and the Pentagon used the system anyway. They used the tool they had just banned, just publicly labeled a security risk, just stripped of contractual protections. Because when the shooting starts, the bureaucratic paper trail becomes inconvenient and the killing machine needs feeding. That contradiction is now sitting at the beating heart of how this war has been conducted. Now, I want to turn to the economic consequences because I think most people watching this have no idea how far the blast radius of this conflict actually extends. And the financial press has been modeling the wrong variables. Everyone is watching the oil price. Brent crude settled above $112 per barrel. U.S. crude reached nearly $100. American gasoline prices climbed 35% from the moment this operation began. Analysts assigned a 40% probability that crude could reach $200 per barrel if the conflict extends into June. The IRGC stated publicly that $200 oil is exactly what they intend to deliver. Nearly 20% of global oil and liquefied natural gas transits the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has effectively closed it. Tanker traffic dropped 70% initially and then collapsed towards zero. 17.8 million barrels per day of oil and fuel flows have been disrupted. Every single day that Strait stays closed, the global economy absorbs damage that compounds. But the oil price is not the number I want you to focus on. The number I want you to focus on is 12.8 million tons. That is the annual LNG production that has been sidelined because of damage to Qatar's liquefied natural gas infrastructure. Qatar Energy's CEO confirmed publicly that 2 of Qatar's 14 LNG trains and 1 of its 2 gas-to-liquid facilities sustained direct damage from Iranian strikes. Repairs will take 3 to 5 years, not 3 to 5 months, 3 to 5 years. The estimated annual revenue loss to Qatar alone is $20 billion. Qatar Energy has already declared force majeure on long-term supply contracts with Italy, Belgium, South Korea, and China. ExxonMobil, which holds significant stakes in the damaged trains, is absorbing losses that will show up in balance sheets and pension funds and retirement accounts across the United States. And then there is the detail that almost nobody is reporting with the weight it deserves. Qatar's helium output will drop 14% as a direct consequence of this damage. 14% of global helium supply disrupted. Helium is not a party balloon commodity. Helium is a critical input in semiconductor manufacturing. A 14% disruption to helium supply threatens chip production globally, which means it threatens every piece of advanced electronics manufactured anywhere on Earth. The blast radius of hitting an LNG facility in the Persian Gulf extends all the way to semiconductor fabrication plants in Taiwan and South Korea and the consumer electronics supply chain that the entire developed world depends on. Compound that with what is happening to fertilizer markets. Up to 30% of internationally traded fertilizers normally transit the Strait of Hormuz. Middle East urea prices have already jumped nearly 20% since the closure began. Every fertilizer price increase feeds directly into food production costs, and food production costs feed into consumer food prices, and consumer food prices feed into the inflation numbers that determine whether governments survive their next election cycle. The people who will pay the highest price for what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now are not in Washington. They are not in Tehran. They are in the parts of the world where families spend 60 or 70% of their income on food and where a 20% price increase is not an inconvenience. It is a catastrophe. The United States and its allies have responded by releasing 400 million barrels from strategic petroleum reserves, the largest coordinated drawdown in recorded history. Washington also temporarily lifted sanctions on select Russian and Iranian oil cargoes to ease market pressure. Let that sit for a moment. The same administration that spent years constructing an elaborate sanctions architecture against both Moscow and Tehran is now quietly waiving those sanctions because the alternative is domestic gasoline prices that make the political math impossible. But those strategic reserve releases are finite. They are drawing down buffers that took years to accumulate. They are not a solution. They are a delay. And every day the Strait of Hormuz stays closed, those buffers drain further toward a floor that, once reached, leaves the global economy with no shock absorber at all. There is one more dimension to this that I want to spend real time on because I have not seen a single mainstream outlet address it with the analytical depth it requires. 17 submarine cables in the Red Sea carry a significant portion of intercontinental internet traffic. 17 cables sitting on the seafloor, running through a corridor that is now an active war zone. Analysts at the network intelligence firm Kentech have noted explicitly that simultaneous disruption to both the Red Sea and Strait of Hormuz corridors would affect global data routing in ways that have no clean precedent in the modern internet era. We have never had both of those corridors threatened simultaneously by an active military conflict. We have never had to model what global commerce looks like when the physical infrastructure of the internet is sitting inside a missile engagement zone. Submarine cables are among the most fragile and most difficult to repair pieces of critical global infrastructure that exist. They sit in deep water. Repair ships are specialized and scarce. Repair operations take months under ideal conditions. And right now, those 17 cables are in anything but ideal conditions. Compound that with the GPS spoofing campaign that has been running in the Strait of Hormuz since late February. More than 1,100 commercial vessels have received falsified GPS signals in that corridor. Navigation itself is compromised. Ships are receiving position data telling them they are somewhere they are not, in a congested maritime choke point with tanker traffic, naval vessels, and commercial shipping all operating in close proximity. Falsified navigation data is not an inconvenience. It is a mechanism for creating maritime disasters. And maritime disasters in the Strait of Hormuz do not stay in the Strait of Hormuz. They cascade outward through insurance markets, through shipping schedules, through the entire global supply chain architecture that moves 80% of world trade by volume across ocean corridors. 5 major marine war risk insurers have canceled coverage for vessels operating in the region entirely. The daily freight rate for very large crude carriers hit an all-time record, a 94% spike in a single trading session. More than 150 vessels sat anchored outside the strait, unable to transit, their operators unwilling to move without insurance coverage that no longer exists at any price. Now, let me bring this back to Washington, because the contradiction at the center of American policy in this conflict is something I find genuinely difficult to accept, not as a political statement, but as someone who tries to hold institutions accountable to the gap between what they say and what they do. The Wall Street Journal, citing Trump administration officials directly, reported that the president has told his aides he is willing to end this war even if the Strait of Hormuz stays largely closed. His stated reasoning is that reopening the strait would require extending the conflict beyond his preferred 4 to 6 week operational window. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stated that the finish line is near. At the same time, the USS Tripoli and the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit entered the theater. Elements of the 82nd Airborne received deployment orders. The administration is weighing an additional 10,000 ground troops. U.S. Central Command confirmed 303 American troops wounded and 13 killed through day 30 of operations. Those are not the numbers of a conflict approaching its finish line. Those are the numbers of a conflict finding its operational rhythm. And the gap between what the administration is saying publicly and what the force posture on the ground actually reflects is a gap that history has taught us to take very seriously. On the 30th of March, Trump posted on Truth Social threatening to obliterate all of Iran's power plants, oil wells, and desalination facilities if a deal was not reached. That is not the language of a commander-in-chief managing an off-ramp. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt stated on day 30 that the Pentagon's 4 to 6 week estimated timeline remains in place, adding, "We are on day 30 today." You do the math. Here is that math. If the 4 to 6 week window is real, this conflict ends or is declared to have ended while the Strait of Hormuz remains functionally closed, while 17 submarine cables sit inside an active conflict zone, while Qatar's LNG infrastructure needs 3 to 5 years to repair, while the insurance architecture for Gulf shipping has collapsed, while the IRGC's targeting list remains active and has already been acted upon 3 times, while over $2 trillion in Gulf technology investment, the planned Stargate campus in Abu Dhabi, the centerpiece of Trump's Gulf tour in May of 2025, sits exposed to a missile doctrine that has already proven it will target servers. The American public is being given a carefully constructed narrative about a manageable, time-limited military operation with a clean ending. The reality in the data centers, in the insurance markets, in the LNG terminals, in the shipping lanes, in the semiconductor supply chains tells a fundamentally different story. The battlefield has been redefined. It no longer has borders in any meaningful military sense. It is defined by wherever the servers are, wherever the cables run, wherever the critical infrastructure of the global digital economy happens to be physically located. And any adversary with ballistic missiles and the strategic patience to publish a targeting list and then execute on schedule has now been handed a template for how to fight the next war. When you build your warfighting machine on top of commercial infrastructure, when you run your targeting AI on the same servers that process civilian bank transfers, when you blur the line between the military domain and the commercial domain so completely that even your own legal framework cannot cleanly distinguish between them, you have handed the other side an argument. Iran did not invent the logic that brought missiles down on servers in Bahrain. That logic was already there, embedded in the contracting decisions and the technology partnerships and the classified cloud deployments that Washington made quietly over the course of a decade. Iran simply followed it to its operational conclusion. And the world, from the semiconductor fabs of East Asia to the fertilizer-dependent farming communities of sub-Saharan Africa to the retirement accounts of American workers with exposure to ExxonMobil, the world is now paying the price for that logic. The economic damage that has already been inflicted is not reversible on any timeline that matters to the governments currently trying to manage it. Oil prices do not return to pre-conflict levels the moment a ceasefire is announced. LNG trains take 3 to 5 years to repair. Insurance markets do not reopen overnight. Shipping companies that have rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope do not immediately revert to the Hormuz corridor the moment someone in Washington declares the situation resolved. The structural damage compounds with every additional day of conflict, and it does not unwind cleanly when the shooting stops. That is the reality of what has already happened. And the question that nobody in Washington is asking loudly enough is the one we should all be sitting with right now. When the servers are the battlefield, and the battlefield is everywhere, what exactly does winning look like?